We're presented with a number of really challenging puzzles in modern and contemporary art by Francesca Esme, Jeffrey Weiss, and Sherry Irvin. And now I invite questions. Aaron.
Thank you both. I have a question for you, Sherry. So while you were cycling through your examples, I was thinking, and way back to the spore, in that there seems to be in those examples that you showed us, decay self-consciously deployed, but towards an experience of either actual or potential disgust, and that there's a kind that disgust is a particularly is a visceral, embodied reaction that certain kinds of decay may prompt, and maybe not in everybody, but that has certain cultural connotations, but also physiological experiences. But that other kinds of decay might not trigger. So I was thinking back to the spores, where you sort of forewarned us about the horror movie quality of that, and that the beauty of the growing spores comes at the cost of the disgusting insect decay. But a lot of other kinds of contexts of decay that we've talked about and seen images of don't prompt that particular kind of visceral response. And so I wonder about the potential place for disgust as a term of reaction in your analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've got right next to me, I brought one of the world experts on disgust. So acutely aware of that. But I guess for me, I wasn't thinking so much of Liz Magor's work, of Zoe Leonard's work. I'm thinking about another work by Liz Magor that decays and developed botulism, and that was a whole other, not just disgust, but fear, but I wasn't thinking of Zoe Leonard's work so much as triggering disgust, although I do, I see sort of why one might think that. For me, I don't think that's quite as much in play, although that is relevant, right? Because that was part of, if we're thinking about AIDS and we're thinking about the physical taboo around AIDS, it does make a lot of sense that decay is being deployed to an end of sort of triggering that sense of disgust. That's part of the, but certainly I agree that degradation and decay can be deployed for in a lot of other ways, and to produce a lot of other reactions too. Because these are just forms of change, right? There's also, you all mentioned at the beginning, sort of the taxonomy of things that can happen, including accretion, and and forms of change need not necessarily be disgusting. They can be there can be all kinds of change that actually is wow, surprising, beautiful, exquisite, kind of. So I think there are lots of different kinds of reactions. And in using these particular examples, I didn't mean to kind of steer it toward disgust, but I do think there are lots of different ways in which, and I think the Kara Walker figure is collapsing. For me, that's not sort of disgust, but it is sort of there is something very rich about just seeing those in that state of disintegration and
smell.
Yeah,
smell. Yeah, that was the thing about the first piece that and when you said the simulation of it wouldn't work for her, and that would be one thing that would be different from a room of rotting fruit and a room of objects that look identical to rotting fruit.
Right.
Would be different olfactory triggers.
Yeah, and it's true that there is a certain point at which it depends on how good your simulation is, right? If you also simulated the olfactory thing, you can fake people out, but the fact is that once that's just a simulation and it's not the real thing, that's triggering a whole different set of assumptions and imaginings and thoughts in you. Whereas the knowledge that you're in the presence of this real thing, that just engages you in this whole bodily and emotional way in a different sense.
As the author of Savouring Disgust, Carolyn, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Well, I think that disgust is a very interesting aesthetic response. Mm-hmm. Not always. Sometimes it's just revulsion. Mm-hmm. Just revulsion, because revulsion is a powerful response. And in the interest of a narrative or of an insight about things like mortality, it very much amplifies the power of an object, and when the object is crafted as a work of art, I presume that is deployed deliberately. Mark Quinn's bust made of his head are fascinating examples of that, because the ones that I have seen pictures of, I've never seen, do we call it real? I've never seen one in the flesh, as it were, in the absence of blood. But they're in climate-controlled boxes. But it's clearly blood that he's got a frost over it, and it's chilling. It is slightly disgusting. It's not super disgusting, but that queasiness, I think, deepens the response to it quite a lot.
Elizabeth.
Right, thank you both. I have a question for Francesca and Jeffrey mainly. And it has to do with your title and the term realization. And I wonder if there's a particular reason why you would choose the term realization instead of, for example, manifestation. I mean, in philosophy, when we talk about the ontology of art, these discussions come up, and I'm myself on record saying that I think art can be an idea or a set of ideas and so on. But if you use a term of realization, there might be an implication that there is no reality there, or no real artwork, if you like, until this instantiation or manifestation. And then you can draw an analogy with fiction, for example, literature or poetry, that, I might have the perfect novel, I don't know, in my computer or somewhere. The fact that it hasn't been printed out yet doesn't make it any less real. So I was wondering if you could say something about that choice of term realization instead of, for example, manifestation or instantiation or something.
Right. Well, we tried to use them all. I mean, part of one of the things that has been challenging for us is the fact that the terminology in the field is extremely evasive in and of itself, and that inconsistent. That a lot of these terms are used often interchangeably: example, version, iteration, realization, and the like. When in fact as we know, they have specific meanings which could potentially be useful, but there's no standardization of terminology in the field. There are attempts, and they exist in various places, but my conversations with my colleagues over the years has told me that that hasn't been established or fixed. But having said that, it's also true that the situation we're describing is frequently compared to a musical score. This is something that was common at the time as well, and the artists themselves, not Judd and Flavin per se, but other artists who were working on who were less grounded in object making, use dance, choreography, and the score and music as a model for the production of work that was event based as opposed to object based, per se. And what I think what I've found that engages us a great deal about the material that we've been addressing over the years is that it's somewhat schizophrenic, that these objects live as they for artists like Judd and Flavin, the work exists only in proposal form until it's realized in object form. So there is a reliance on the convention of the object in the history of sculpture making on the one hand, but because they can be subject to a repetition, to iteration and reiteration and refabrication, they live in this other place too. And it's that double identity that interests us a great deal. So we have to rely on realization to a degree as a word, because objects matter to all of these artists in a very specific way. But the period itself demonstrates that this was a very, very wobbly, that the status of work, of different kinds of work during this period was unstable in that respect.
I would just add that it became actually very useful for us in a way to kind of harness and expand on that idea of that the artwork can be separated into work which is concept, proposal, and object. And there can be multiple objects that, kind of authentically manifest the work as just the idea. But it's one of the things also that in the course of our creating this collection category called decommission, which is how we, in the end, kind of dealt with the contested works in the Guggenheim's collection that we felt really needed to have a new classification. One of the concerns was not wanting to delete them, right? That wasn't the intent. It was to prevent them from being misrepresented in the future. So we wanted the object to not be misrepresented in the future, but we want the work to be able to live on and be accessed in some way, even if it only exists as a historic record, the sketch, the description. So those two aspects of the work are very present in what we've been thinking about.
Yeah, and I just want to add that the tenuousness of the object, either well made or badly made according to the standards of the artist, is an important part of what we're doing. So that's where I come to reject the score as a model, because these objects still live between the idea of the score on the one hand and the idea of the conventional, even unique sculptural object on the other. And the fact that that never goes away is crucial to recognizing, I think, to acknowledging what's complicated about this situation, especially with respect to stewardship.
We began our session a little later than intended, surprise, surprise. So we'll go on and take a few more questions before we have our break. I'm good, Eric.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you. Sherry, they're talking about exemplification. I thought was really helpful, because it was like that's like I was getting at when I was talking about the bejeweled lemon that represented but did not exemplify. But I didn't think to use, so thank you. But then I have a question about the Leonard piece. So you said that she ultimately rejected the conservator's effort, right, to conserve the piece. And I guess so I'm wondering about what the ultimate upshot of that was, and what you think about what is a sort of a successful conservation in light of that rejection. Because I was thinking about it in relation to the line or lack of line between conservation and documentation, right? So when you have works that are intended to be ephemeral, right? So I'm thinking of like street art here, right? There's a lot of emphasis on documentation, right? As a sort of like a form of conservation. Once we've sort of given up the idea that the works themselves are going to be conserved over some long period of time. So in her rejecting of the conserved fruits, like, do you think that the photo documentation, thus like the door is open for it to serve that role in some way, because we've already rejected the idea that you could have adequate conservation without the actual decaying, right? So like one kind of conservation is just off the table. So does that open the door for these other ones to be satisfying?
If I'm not mistaken, and there are probably people in the room who know better than I do, actually, I think that those 25 pieces, which were subjected to some of the more aggressive conservation, I think that they may have been retained as sort of documents of the work, and that sort of thing does sometimes happen. So there are other cases too where there's a sort of negotiation that happens with conservation over time, and like I mentioned Liz Mago earlier because I had it in my mind. She's got a work in the National Gallery of Canada that's called Time and Mrs. Tiber, where she found these jars of preserves that a woman named Mrs. Tiber on Vancouver Island had created, and she decided to display a bookcase full of jars of preserves and a box of recipes, which may also, I think, have been Mrs. Tiber's. But Liz Magor herself decided to make some additional jars of preserves, but she didn't really know how to can properly. And those are the ones that like sort of started to turn to mush, and they developed like botulism toxin inside, and they also developed like these whiskers on the outside of the jars. So yeah, it was obviously a serious problem. Like botulism, that's a step too far, right? Talking about potential for us and potential for the real potential for the museum staff should there be any breakage or leakage of those objects. So ultimately, you know, she had said, oh no, I want the work just to have its natural lifespan, but she was like, oh, botulism, okay. So she got somebody who actually knew how to can to help her, and she made replacement objects. But she still said, you know, my expectation was that the material life of this work would be about as long as I expect to have left, you know, like 50 years, but not 5 was not enough. So she remade some of them, but she also said when the work's no longer exhibitable, it's going to move into the study collection of the museum, which I believe has now happened. So there are all kinds of ways in which sometimes you've got objects living on as documents or decommissioning. I think that's an example of sort of decommissioning of an object. The work is still in some sense in the collection, but no longer exhibitable because it's not something that can be re-realized. And then, you know, I guess in a way, like the pictorial depictions have a similar status to what they have for ephemeral works of performance art, right? It's what lets us know. You know, we look at pictures from Marina Abramovich's Rhythm Zero, and that's how we know what happened. You know, that kind of brings out for us what happened, but we're not encountering the real work in a greater sense and seeing a representation here as opposed to there. It's just, but it is an effective document for us to help us know what was going on.
We'll take one more question from the back somewhere.
I have one that sort of transcends both presentations, and it's really about relics. Maybe I'm channeling Kentucky's absence. I would like to talk a little bit more about what you mean by genuine, I think. There's a word that sort of snuck in at the end of Sherry's presentation, and about genuine having this meaning that sort of transcends a literal definition and goes more to an emotive, perceptive, on the part of the observer sort of aspect. And then I'm also just really interested in how Francesca and Jeffrey would have, through the evolution of this project, seen the paperwork evolve, because the paperwork is the genuine autographic indexical artist's hand. It becomes like a relic of what like whatever this unrealizable or decommissioned work is. Has the paperwork now assumed a different position within the museum? Like, I think when we spoke to you several years ago, you said, no, those are part of the museum archives. They're not the works. They're not the accessioned artworks. I don't know if that has shifted as you started to see the object dematerialize and the paperwork become, I mean, I think the autographic nature of particularly the Flavin pieces, which are hand-drawn, sort of signals to me that's where the genuine work lies. And
If they're not hand-drawn by Flavin, by the way.
Right, yeah.
Just to throw a curveball.
Oh, wow.
Oh, well, just to you know, we attempted to have that one slide to represent the diversity of the types of materials that would fall within that category. And to answer your question, in some cases, some were demoted. In some cases, some were elevated. So when all of those materials came into the collection, there was a kind of inability for people to accurately decipher the significance and identity of each sheet and properly kind of label them and categorize them and assign them either, you know, as artwork component and something that should sort of live as the artwork in some cases, or something that should live in the curatorial file, or something that should live in the archive. And so we've gone through to systematically reevaluate what each sheet represents and where it should live, to aid in interpretation in the future, so things aren't misinterpreted.
The work, conventionally speaking, and I say that, but the work is represented by and I'm going to beg a lot of questions when I say this, I'm going to say, by the concept, not by the sheet. The concept can migrate from sheet to sheet and take different forms in the contract as opposed to the certificate, as opposed to the working drawing and so forth. Letters, it's even also discursive. But none of those things are the work. They are representations of the work, which either lives in object form or doesn't. But none of them have become the work itself. Some of the Naumann drawings, which we used to think of as just working drawings in a kind of demoted sense, have been elevated only because drawing is in and of itself a complicated thing in his practice, and those sheets were sometimes displayed by him, and so they therefore need now not to be in the archive, but to be stored with drawing. It becomes a question of nomenclature and classification. And therefore of status. But the work that the drawing represents a work another work. It is a representation of another work. It may be a work in and of itself, but it also is, as information, it represents the work and will never be called, never be identified as the work.
Good, thanks very much. I think we